Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are taking a fascinating historical journey into one of the most transformative, expansive, and, well, ultimately finite political structures in human history. If I asked you to name the largest empire the world has ever seen, you might immediately think of the Romans, right? Or maybe the Mongols. But the true answer actually lies with a much more recent power. Today, we're unpacking the dramatic rise, the absolute peak, and the sudden collapse of the British Empire. Think about this for a second. How did a small, damp island, roughly the size of the state of Oregon, manage to eventually control 1/4 of the entire planet? I mean, the sheer geographical mismatch between the size of the British Isles and the vast expanses of the earth they would come to govern is absolutely staggering. It's like a giant puzzle of history, economics, and naval dominance, and we're going to piece the whole thing together right now. To make sense of centuries of history, here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start with the rise of naval power, move into the peak of the empire, examine the empire's collapse, look at the modern United Kingdom, and finally get the Commonwealth explained. Okay, let's dive in.
Section 1. Rise of Naval Power.
Before Britain could conquer the globe, they literally had to conquer the oceans. Their geography completely dictated their destiny here. Because Britain is an island, engaging with the outside world meant mastering the sea. So by the 16th century, this basic necessity had evolved into some highly advanced naval capabilities. But here is the real catalyst. The year 1600, the birth of the East India Company. This wasn't just the British military expanding. No, this was a corporate entity that eventually fielded a private army twice the size of the actual British military. That sparked the birth of the empire and led directly to the formation of early colonies throughout the 17th century. And once that naval foundation was set, the expansion was just ruthless. The British pushed into the Americas, carved vast territories out of Africa, established really deep footholds in Asia, most notably in India, and colonized the entire continent of Australia. The ships that started simply as a way to defend a small island had become the ultimate tools of global expansion. Section 2. Peak of the Empire. Following the end of the First World War, British imperial dominance reached a peak unlike any other in recorded history. 24%. Just pause and really think about that for a second. Nearly a quarter of all the land on this planet was administered, controlled, or claimed by a government sitting in London. It was the absolute zenith of their territorial power. And they weren't just claiming empty dirt either. Over 400 million people, representing countless different cultures, languages, and religions, were subjects of the British Crown. It was this vast demographic monopoly that fundamentally rewired global trade, migration, and honestly, all of human history. This huge monopoly gave birth to a famous boast you've probably heard, the empire on which the sun never sets. And it wasn't just some poetic metaphor. It was a literal geographical reality. Because their territories were spread across every single time zone on Earth, at any given moment of the day or night, the sun was shining on at least one piece of British territory. It was a completely uninterrupted global reach. Section 3. The Empire's Collapse. But as history always shows us, no empire lasts forever. The downfall of this global superpower was a devastating three-step cascade. Step 1, World War I severely drains British resources. The sheer financial and human cost of the Great War left the empire structurally weakened. Step 2, just 2 decades later, World War II essentially breaks the British economy. In this brutal stroke of historical irony, winning the war effectively bankrupted them. They simply couldn't afford to maintain those global territories anymore. And finally, step 3, global independence movements, which were totally energized by the post-war climate, succeed. Across Asia, Africa, and beyond, nations fought for and won their rightful sovereignty, shattering that imperial structure for good. Section 4. The modern United Kingdom. So even without an empire, the UK's geopolitical standing today relies on a few modern pillars of power. They still maintain a permanent veto on the UN Security Council, they're a leading member of NATO, and they remain an established nuclear power. Plus, London is still one of the absolute centers of global finance, backed by a really strong, highly developed economy. And perhaps most importantly, the UK wields tremendous soft power through its culture, media, universities, and the English language itself. Britain essentially managed to transition from an empire of territorial conquest to a modern state that exerts massive global influence without needing to own a quarter of the world's land. Section 5. The Commonwealth Explained. Now, this is where a ton of confusion lies today. A really common misconception is that the UK still rules over countries like Canada, India, or Australia. That is absolutely factually incorrect. While the British Empire was directly ruled by London, the modern Commonwealth of Nations is a purely voluntary association. The UK does not rule them, they don't command them, and they definitely do not dictate their policies. These are sovereign nations, meaning they are completely independent, with their own governments and absolute authority. Countries choose to remain in the Commonwealth for shared values, trade benefits, and historical ties. They are not subordinate to London. They're entirely self-governing. Actually, scratch that. Let's talk about the monarchy for a second, because that always trips people up. The British monarch's role is purely symbolic in some Commonwealth realms. Yes, a country like Canada or Australia recognizes the king as head of state, and sure, his face might be on their coins. But it's a ceremonial title. The British government and the British monarch hold absolutely zero political power over these independent governments. It's really just a nod to history, not a lever of modern power. So what does this all mean? Is Britain still powerful today? We've seen them go from a small island to a global empire covering a quarter of the earth, right back to being an island nation. But maybe power isn't always about how much land you control. The shift from the hard power of colonization to the soft power of diplomacy, finance, and voluntary alliances like the Commonwealth, well, it asks us a much deeper question about what global supremacy actually means in the 21st century. I highly encourage you to think about how power has truly shifted in our modern world. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the history behind the map.